Hello and welcome to Planet Smasher HQ. As I sit here, it's about halfway through the SPACE GITS Kickstarter. Huge thanks to everyone that has supported already, and if you haven't, click on through to Kickstarter and check out the SPACE GITS campaign. Now, whilst the campaign's running, I've got a few bits and bobs to do, like making backer updates, responding to comments, and creating videos such as this one. But the main thing that I'm working on is the layout for the SPACE GITS rulebook. In this video, I want to show you my process for laying out a tabletop rulebook. Okay, so let me show you how I'm setting about laying out the SPACE GITS rulebook. The tools that I'm using are predominantly Adobe ones, so you'll see a lot of Adobe Photoshop and a lot of Adobe InDesign. But some other tools that have been useful are some bits of card that I've torn up, a camera that I'm using to take top-down photos. I tried with a scanner, but the camera seems to work better and produce clearer images. And I also use my iPad with a pen to create sketches and doodles and bits and bobs, which I haven't done that much of yet, although I used them a fair bit for the SPACE GITS intro video, but I might end up using those more as the layout comes together. Now, the way that I started this layout process was actually in Google Docs. So I've been writing my prototype rulebook for the last few months, adding new sections and writing all the words in it. And I formatted that Google Doc as an A5 document because I knew that I wanted to have this as a small format A5 rulebook in the end. And that gave me an opportunity to not exactly lay the book out, but at the very least sort of structure what information was going to lie on each page and add some page breaks so that I could figure out where two-page spreads might contain enough space for all of the rules on a particular section, or whether it was going to take more than a few pages. So, for example, I wanted the movement rules in the core rules section. I wanted the movement rules to just spread across a single double-page spread so you could read and see all of the movement rules in one place. But that wasn't possible for the fancy gear because it's a long list of groovy stuff, and so that spreads over several pages. So just sort of laying it out, not laying it out, just arranging it in Google Docs gave me a very rough and ready way of figuring out across the 120 odd pages where everything is. And so that's actually proving to be a kind of useful guide and prototype as I head into the full layout. I'm not going to exactly replicate every page that I created in Google Docs, but it gives me a sort of architecture for the information and allowed me to get to the next important stage, which was to head into Google Sheets and do some planning of exactly which pages were where. Now, I should underline, this is my first time laying out a full-sized book from start to finish. I've laid out some zines in a much lighter way, and in InDesign I've made a couple of like pamphlets, sort of 2 and 4 page long things, but I've never attempted something that's like more than 100 pages. And so I wasn't sure what the right process would be, and I had a long think about that before I even started. But the other thing I wanted to do was to plan out the pages. And so here in this spreadsheet, I have gone through and using the Google Doc prototype as my sort of guideline, I've tried to figure out where all of the pages are going to lie, whether they're going to be a left or a right page, and what the page numbers are and so forth. And it also just let me, because I think it's going to be 128 pages, I've sort of decided I'll work to that as a spec for no reason other than it's easier to have an actual goal. So I've got my 128 pages, and having laid everything out, I can sort of see where I've got gaps and where I've maybe got opportunities for including more photographs or inventing some other guff like adding a hobby guide or a painting guide or something. So I found this bit is really useful. It's also given me the ability to create a tracker, which when I'm working on big projects like this, I do like to have a percentage tracker so that I can finish a day's work and feel like a number went up and I know where I'm at and how much my level of panic should be set at any particular point in the process. So that's cool. So having created the outline for the book and knowing that I had these pages to produce, with the confidence that I kind of had a prototype already assembled in this PDF that I've created from Google Docs, then the next question was, well, what is the workflow that I'm going to use in InDesign to create this? And I want this book to be really colourful and beautiful and chaotic. And the reason I've been tearing up these pieces of paper and photographing them, and then taking the photographs into Photoshop and cutting out the little pieces of paper using the magic cutting out tool that they now have. At one point it was my job to cut out images of things from their background, and I did that all day long, and it was like a full-time occupation. Now this button here just does it in a second. It's nice. So with all of that compositing and layering and shuffling around of objects, I knew that I wanted to create the background images in Photoshop, because previously I've tried to use InDesign as a complicated layering tool. I did this in the A Billion Suns Quick Start, and the problem I found is that unlike Photoshop, which, I've used that for 20 odd years and I've never had any problem with transparency between layers and layering layers on top of each other, but in InDesign, there was these times where I would drop an image, like an illustration of a spaceship, onto the document, and I would set the blending, the layer blending, to be whatever it needed to be. And then when I produced the PDF out the other side as an export, it would have this faint little line all around the image, and I could never figure out how to fix it. And there was a few different problems like that, where I just found that InDesign was not, I couldn't trust it when it came to laying out layers on top of each other. So I thought, well, why don't I just treat InDesign as the book making and text organizing and page structuring application, because that seems to be the thing that it's good at. And what I'll do is I'll have all of the text in InDesign, but I'll make all of the underlying background images in Photoshop. And there's a function in InDesign called Place, which makes this super easy because InDesign and Photoshop work really nicely together. So what I'm doing here is, when I've got a page, I create a fresh Photoshop template with the either the left or the right margins, and I'll talk about how I set the margins up in a minute. And then I go into InDesign and I place, using Command D, a new file, and I select my Photoshop file, and I plot that in here, making sure it's in the right place with regards to the bleed on the page. And then this is like an auto-updating background image, and so I can pop text over the top of this sort of background image and style that text using InDesign's paragraph and character styles tools, which are extremely powerful. But if I need to move a block of text around, or the background sort of scrappy bit of paper isn't big enough, then all I do is I can click from InDesign straight into this Photoshop file. It will open it up in Photoshop. I can nudge whatever layer I need to nudge, or add an element, or move things about, save it here in Photoshop, and then when I come back to InDesign, I just need to update the link, and pop, we get an updated background image. And so it does involve a bit of flipping backwards and forwards, but it's so easy and so fast, it doesn't feel at all onerous. And this way I can kind of feel confident that no matter what crazy nonsense I choose to do with the background image layout, it's Photoshop that's doing it, and I trust Photoshop to do it, and what ends up is a sort of flat image, as far as I can work out, that appears underneath the text frames in InDesign. So this seems to be working. This is a really nice workflow so far. So let me talk a little bit about the margins. So I got a specification from the printer. That was interesting. And it was a little bit dense to understand. But what I basically needed to do was to make sure that between InDesign and my Photoshop templates, that I had a really consistent, strong understanding of where the margins and the bleed and all the various guides are. So in InDesign, I started with an A5 page size, and I added a 5mm bleed all the way around it. And so that gives you a sort of like a height of 110mm, but then you have to add 5 plus 5 for the bleed. So the total page size is 220 millimeters. And so that's the size of document that I needed to create in Photoshop, because in Photoshop I'm not creating an A5 background image, I'm creating an A5 background image with 5mm bleeds. So here's my Photoshop template. It's got an A5 dimension, but with the 5mm bleed in all directions, so it's slightly larger. And then I need to figure out where the page margins should be and where any other like critical elements should be. And in my layout in Google Doc, I knew that sometimes things looked good in single columns and sometimes they looked good in double columns. I'm never going to use 3 columns. A5 just doesn't have the width to support that. I also had made a prototype of these sort of section titles. I'm calling them breadcrumbs. I'm not exactly sure what they are, but like I like it in rulebooks where you can quickly see where you are. Like in the Gaslands rulebook, I'm always losing where the weapon special rules are because the book is not well delineated about which section you're currently in. And so I wanted little coloured tabs or something to show which section of the book you are in, and then as you're flipping through it, it should make finding the relevant bit of rule text easier. So I needed to leave space for that. I needed to leave space for the page numbers. And, this is the first time designing a book for proper thick printing. This is going to be a hardback book. It's going to be A5. It's going to be about 128 pages. So it's going to be quite thick. And there will be, when you open the book, you won't be able to see all the way to the edge of the pages because they'll be glued together in the middle. So I did a bit of Googling to find out what the right sort of page margins would be, and I also took some other rule books from people that I like and my prototype rulebook, and I literally took a ruler and measured where their margins were, what other clever people had done, and to check out how far away the page numbers were and so forth, and where their margins were. So I concluded on essentially like 10mm margins from the outer edge and 20mm margins from the inner edge, with the assumption that like 10mm of that will be sort of eaten by the binding process and the pages will end up feeling centered, even though they're on the wonk, because I want, when you open the book, I want it to at least look like it's centered on the piece of paper. The margins top and bottom, I sort of started with 10mm margins, but then I realized I needed to leave extra space for these section headers and page number elements. So then I sort of did some calculations and figured that out. So let me show you this working this all out was no joke. I went into a spreadsheet, created a spreadsheet, and added all of my numbers in terms of what's my bleed, what's my page size, what do I think my margin widths are, blah blah blah, and created this series of numbers so I didn't have to work them out each time, which is basically where do the guides go. So for example, here in Photoshop, I have this big page that is including the bleeds, so I need to add a margin, a guideline to show where the bleed is. I've decided to use a red line here, and the spreadsheet tells me what the number to put here is, and so then I can create a guide for where the bleed line would be. And then I go through this with each of the elements, so adding guides for where the outer margins of the text area are, creating guides for the gutter in the middle of the 2 columns. And that's cool because I won't always use it, but it's nice to see it there so I can see what my options are and use that as part of the grid that I'm using. And adding these additional guidelines to show where the header section header image and the page numbers are. So this is great. And then I took those numbers and kind of recreated them in Adobe InDesign so that I've got the ability to place text frames in exactly the same place. And so now when I flip between InDesign and Photoshop, I've got the guides in the same place and I can kind of really easily eyeball where things should be. Now, to a degree, I'm sort of cheating with this as my first extended book layout, because I've chosen a style somewhat deliberately which is kind of chaotic and on the wonk. So I've been learning some things about baseline grids and and lay out XY grids, that to a degree I'm going to use some of that information that I'm learning, but I'm going to ignore other parts of it. So on some pages, I deliberately want the text not to line up on a baseline because it's supposed to look like these little torn bits of post-it note are sitting at sort of random on the page. And so having them matching on the baseline so that everything looks nice and rigorous would just look kind of fake and weird, and it would destroy the illusion. Whereas on these other layouts, so this spread here has all the text aligned with the baselines across the 2 pages of the spread, because it's kind of a structured piece of information and I want everything to look neat and tidy. I could go back and remake this spread, maybe I will, and say like break out one of these sections and turn it into a sort of post-it note and deliberately make it look like it's introduced as a foreign object onto the page. But yeah, that's kind of part of the fun here, is I wanted some freedom to experiment with different layout elements, and this kind of, the game is already crazy and chaotic, and using torn bits of paper and kind of rough and ready organic shapes is helping make it feel chaotic, and so the layout decisions that I'm making are quite chaotic as well. Where did I learn to do all this stuff? Because I've never laid out a book, but I've done a ton of work in Adobe products. Partly, like, for a little while it was my job to lay things out. So, I mean, we're talking like 15, 20 years ago, when I was making the interactive components of enhanced CD singles. So I learned a lot of this from just messing around for many years. I used to make album, well, in fact, as recently as this year, I have been making album artwork, like CD inlays and liner notes and stuff for friends' bands. And so I think it's just, like everything, just messing about, playing and gathering skills slowly. So in this case, when it comes to a new spread, I've got the text in front of me from my prototype rulebook, and I'm starting by just grabbing some of these paper layout elements that I've created a library of. I can sling them in kind of just instinctually. I've got a vague colour palette for each section of the rules, which I'm going to stick to, but I'm going to break it here and there to add sort of pops and splashes of colour. And right now everything is just built from this kind of set of photographs and the set of torn paper. Sometimes I'm using the torn paper, the outline of the torn paper, as a layer mask on the photographs, because that is quite a nice way of creating some organic, rough-looking shapes to take the photographs and kind of look like they've been torn off. I'm using a little bit of drop shadow here and there, but I'm being a bit cautious about that because too much of that can look a bit phony. And I haven't really introduced a ton of other elements yet, but I might as I get through the layout and decide that there's little elements that need to be added. Yeah, so that's how I'm approaching the layout of the SPACE GITS rulebook. I've still got quite a lot to learn, and I'm learning a lot during this process. I expect that I will learn a fair bit more when I actually hand the near final document off to the printers and they run it through their tests to see if it will print properly. I'm going to probably learn a few things that I've got wrong. Hopefully they won't require me to remake too much stuff. But yeah, I just wanted to share this kind of work in progress of the SPACE GITS rulebook, show off some of the spreads and how cool the rulebook is going to look. This is the first time I've ever got to truly lay out one of my own games into a beautiful object from start to finish with total artistic control, and I've got to say it's super exciting and really satisfying, and I can't wait to have this in front of me. I hope this behind the scenes view into how I'm creating the rulebook was interesting to you. If you have any questions about what I'm doing, please drop them in the comments below and I will try and answer them. If you have any advice, because you have some experience in doing this, which I don't, then please also drop a comment and let me know if I'm bodging something up. And yeah, if you have not checked out the SPACE GITS Kickstarter, then head on over to Kickstarter, search for SPACE GITS, click the one with the giant orange and yellow image, and please consider backing my dexterity-based miniatures game. All right, until next time, I will see you later. Bye-bye.